If MSG causes headaches, why doesn't everyone in China have one? Welcome back to Rooted Restless. I'm your host, Marianne Smith Edge. And today we're going to talk about ingredients. Ingredients in food, of course, seems to be a hot topic. And sometimes the myths outweigh the facts, such is the case of the ingredient that we're talking about today, a century-old ingredient known as monosodium glutamate, but more commonly known as MSG. May is National Asian Heritage Month, and what a better time to really talk about an ingredient such as MSG with an expert and friend who really can give us a lot of background. My guest today is Mary Lee Chen, registered dietitian, speaker, an MSG expert, and a very good friend that will really give us insight around the whole myths and facts around MSG. So Mary Lee, thank you spending a little bit of time coming from Denver today to really talk about the ingredient. So first of all, give us a little history on the whole aspect of MSG.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I loved how you introduced me as an MSG expert, not only from a personal basis, because I've eaten it my whole life and my mom used it, but also professionally in terms of working with the Ajinomoto Company and the Glutamate Association. When we talk about history of MSG, it was discovered in 1908 by a Japanese professor, Dr. Ikeda. And as the story goes, he just loved his wife's Japanese dashi, a broth made from seaweed. And so as a scientist, the curiosity got to him and he asked the question, what gives dashi its deep, savory flavor? And he embarked on some research and discovered it was glutamic acid. And that added to the whole pantheon of flavors and tastes that we are used to. As you know, we have sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. And the glutamate that he discovered added umami, that rich, deep, savory flavor. And the company in Japan, Ajinomoto, developed the MSG as an ingredient to provide depth of flavor to foods. It was Dr. Ikeda who, when he discovered the glutamic acid, put it with a salt and stabilized it. So it's called monosodium glutamate, or MSG for short.
Which is a great story, and it's interesting that was discovered back in 1908. But this whole aspect of umami flavor really hasn't been introduced all that many years, kind of in that whole palette of our flavors. Suddenly with mushrooms and a lot of other things, we talk about umami, and it was like, oh. Yeah, it's what we've known. We just hadn't identified it sometimes.
Well, I will say that's because we're in the Western culture now.
Right.
And so umami was not developed as a flavor until recently and became very, very trendy about, I'd say, 2 decades ago, when a lot of chefs, particularly the celebrity chefs, jumped on the umami trend. As a matter of fact, there were hamburgers that were developed that were called the umami bomb. And chefs were known for putting out the umami bomb. But when you go back to Asian cultures, and just about every single Asian culture, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Southeast Asia, we all knew about that umami flavor. And we had a lot of foods that contain glutamate that develop that rich, savory taste that MSG or glutamate delivers.
Well, let's talk about the foods. And as you said, you are an expert. You grew up with it. It is part of the, as you mentioned, the Asian culture. How did that come into being so much part of the Asian culture, and what you've known as what your mother did and probably your grandmother in that regard in the foods?
A big part of the flavor profile developed in Asian foods is based on fermented foods, and in particular, fermented soybeans. Now, all foods contain protein, and all protein containing foods contain some amount of glutamate, and some foods contain more than others. When you ferment foods, then it breaks down the protein and you get glutamic acid, and that provides a savory flavor. And if you understand Asian cooking, there is a lot of fermented sauces and flavorings that are used in Asian foods, and it's throughout all the cultures. Now, is this where you want me to show all the stuff that I just pulled out of my refrigerator and pantry this morning?
I would love for you to talk about some of those. When you talk about, it's not just, sometimes we think MSG is just something we're sprinkling in food or so to speak, but I think this is a good way to really talk about how it's really part of a culture of what many of us, what you grew up with, and many of us have come to really enjoy. So I've been in your kitchen. So but I haven't gone through your cabinets. So I want to please give us some examples.
Well, Marianne, it would be hard to miss my bottle of soy sauce. I have a tendency to buy gallon containers of this.
I have noticed a really lot.
And, we go through several of those a year. But just going through my pantry this morning, I came up, and I don't know if you can see all of this, but let me put it in front of my face.
I can
this
see.
Whole pantheon of different soy sauces, many of the sauces that are based on soybeans, and they're fermented. And again, it's that fermentation that breaks down the protein, providing the glutamic acid and the flavor of umami. But, for soy sauce, it has gotten so trendy and just a main part of American food culture. It even comes in specific niche products. So here we have gluten-free soy sauce. And then we have Chinese soy sauce that it has some mushrooms in it. And then we have premium fish sauce from Thailand. And we have low sodium soy sauce. Things that I use in my kitchen a lot are salted black fermented beans, which add a richness and depth of flavor to beef dishes. We have bean sauce, oyster sauce, black bean garlic sauce. I have here chili sauce with garlic. Let's see, this is fermented soybean curd made from soybeans cakes, but this one is without chili. You can get it with chili too. And then, of course, like my mom did, we have a shaker of MSG. And in Asian kitchens, you will find shakers of MSG. I think many of your listeners and viewers will know it as Accent is one of the brands there. And so it is ubiquitous throughout Asian culture, Asian cultural foods. But it's not only in Asia. So there is an Australian food that contains MSG commercially. Can you guess what it is?
I can't. I don't.
Vegemite. The Australian food ingredient that contains MSG, which is added commercially, is Vegemite.
Oh, I've had it in New Zealand.
Okay, great. And in Spanish, there is sazon, which is Spanish for seasoning. And that's a pre-mixed spice blend widely used in Latin American and Caribbean cooking. And then when we use things like aged Parmesan cheese, mushrooms, tomatoes, particularly in the form of tomato paste or ketchup. Those are high in glutamate. So that whole ubiquitous flavor that we want, that is savory and so well loved, is not just Asian. It's not just MSG. It is throughout all food cultures that appreciate the deep savory depth of flavor.
So we talk about, you've done a beautifully job of really talking about the flavor and umami flavor and the MSG, and for being such a critical part of just cooking and creating those flavors, and especially coming from the Asian culture. Why have we had this controversy that has seemed to boil up over the years around MSG? I know I've eaten in your kitchen and I have not walked away with any headaches, so that's the reality. But with your background, why has this become sort of a controversial at times?
Well, it actually started going back to 1968. And that's when a letter, now not research, but a letter to the editor to the New England Journal of Medicine from a physician said that he ate in a Chinese restaurant the evening before. And this morning he had a headache and radiating pain. And he was wondering if it was caused by ingredients in the Chinese meal that he had had the evening before. And he postulated it could have been a high salt intake, it could have been the MSG, or maybe the wine used in the cooking. Well, the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine immediately jumped on it, labeled the letter Chinese restaurant syndrome, and that's where the term came about. Researchers and the culture jumped on that at all. Thousands of letters poured into the New England Journal of Medicine complaining about, oh, yes, I ate it in a Chinese restaurant and the MSG gave me a headache. It gave me heart palpitations. It gave me radiating pain in my right arm or left arm. And researchers also jumped on that. Now, Marianne, you and I really embrace science, and we know what good scientific research is. We try to make it as unbiased as possible. But during that time, there was residual biases and racial prejudice against Asia and China, to the point where it's called the Chinese restaurant syndrome, even though Italian foods, steakhouses, home kitchens, which at that time used a lot of like the TV dinners and prepared foods, contained a lot of glutamate and MSG. So I find it, from a very personal basis, rather racist that it was labeled Chinese restaurant syndrome instead of any other ethnic identity. Going back even deeper in history, in 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusionary Act, and Chinese were not allowed to come into this country unless they were businessmen, and they were not allowed to bring their families over. There was fear about the Chinese laborers taking jobs away from Westerners in the United States. And it is that prejudice that carried forth for many, many decades. As a matter of fact, the Chinese Exclusionary Act was not revoked until 1942. So there is a deep history of xenophobia. And I think the prejudice and that whole MSG controversy was based on residual prejudice, the view that Asia was, and Orientalism was exotic, unknown, and maybe a little suspicious. The irony of this is that, do you know who the letter writer was to the New England Journal of Medicine?
I don't.
It was Dr. Kwok, a Chinese immigrant who came to the United States in the 1960s.
Yes, I did not know that. that is most interesting. So why would he write the letter?
He didn't specifically identify it as a Chinese restaurant syndrome. He did identify and mention 3 ingredients that he had in the dishes the night before: the wine, the salt, and the MSG. As a result of that, scientists jumped on it and started doing research. And this goes back to unbiased or biased research. And there were a number of studies that came out that said, oh, yes, MSG is a terrible ingredient. It causes the headaches. It causes Parkinson's. It causes whatever you wanted it to do. There were some researchers that were injecting MSG directly into mouse brains and finding some untoward effects. No, my belief is even if you inject something as healthy as broccoli into a brain, it's going to cause some untoward effects.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that was not unbiased research, but more research and continuing research has shown that MSG is a perfectly safe ingredient. As a matter of fact, the FDA did intensive studies, surveys, and research. And the FDA and many World Health Organizations say MSG is a safe ingredient to use. More recently, and I was part of this initiative, it was about 6 or 7 years ago, Ajinomoto started a campaign to really educate the public about the use and misuse of MSG. And so many celebrity chefs jumped on board, Anthony Bourdain, for example, and said MSG is fine to use. It does not cause harmful effects. It does not live up to the stereotype of being a bad ingredient. So over the past, I would say 6 or 7 years, the attitude toward MSG as a, quote, bad ingredient has definitely shifted. And you will see many articles in food magazines and online social blogs that talk about the role of umami in the flavor profile of our food and the use of and safe use of MSG in our food.
So I think it's interesting when you talk about how it even started. And I mean, I knew that it was, but I keep thinking that the individual just had too much sake, probably, that that caused the headaches and not anything else. But really, the legit research has been done over the years. But also, I think what you've stressed is that yes, it came from it came more from one specific culture, the Asian culture. We now embrace that in so many ways, but at the same time, the actual glutamate aspect is not just found it is fermentation. So as you mentioned, Parmesan cheese, it really crosses the cultures in that aspect. So helps put that in perspective, I think, when you mention it.
Yes, and Marianne, I think you bring up a very important point there. Glutamic acid is found naturally in so many foods. I had mentioned some of those before, the mushrooms, in aged cheeses like the aged Parmesan. And you will find it very rich in things like beef because it is protein-based. And so it is ubiquitous in our whole food supply.
Now, let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne and Mary Lee. Earlier this year, Marianne and I talked about how black currant is the 2026 McCormick Flavor of the Year. Flavor House Tea Hasagawa USA offers an additional take, naming fermentation, bitterness from botanicals, hyperlocal herbs, and regional ingredients as the pathway toward more complex flavors that also have clean label considerations. Another prevailing trend is towards spicy combinations of sweet and spicy. Think Mike's Hot Honey, which is one of my favorites. Innova Market Insights has learned through social media listening that nearly 3/4 of mentions of spicy are positive, and the company's recent report on savory flavors notes that innovation in savory is particularly shaped by cultural heritage as well as nostalgia. Authentic flavors also can help elevate the sensory experience for the consumer.
Now, let's return to our conversation. So I would say at this point, and you mentioned some of the continuing science and looking at it, is that it kind of stems back that perhaps this, and I think you've identified it, is that some of this controversy was very unfounded from the very beginning, but folks, whether based on racial bias and then anecdotes, kind of jumped on the bandwagon, so to speak, to say this must be the problem, which kind of happens today as well, and maybe even more so, is that we take an anecdote without looking at all the confounding factors and say, oh, this is bad or this is good without the documentation. Mm.
Right. And we certainly, with all our decades of experience in nutrition, we have seen so many myths. And sometimes they change back and forth, too. I think one thing that I can cite is an interesting one called the oatmeal. I think Halo. And it probably wasn't about 30 years ago, oatmeal was identified as a superfood. And everybody was eating like bowls of oatmeal, not only for breakfast, but also at lunch and dinner. And then I went to my grocery store and found glazed oatmeal donuts. There's something a little odd about that. But I think we as consumers, we're interested in health. We're interested in good flavor, but we want simple answers. Don't give me nuances. Tell me if something is good or bad. And therefore, we get something in the past like MSG is bad. And granola bars are good, even though granola bars might be filled with a lot of sugar and fat and high calories. So I believe part of that belief is looking for a simple answer to good health. And so when it comes to MSG, there are nuances, just like there is for any other food. And if somebody says to me, oh, every time I eat MSG, I get a headache, or I have this really strange feeling in my mouth, the solution isn't to tell them, oh, that's all in your head. The solution is to tell them, well, don't eat MSG. I am going to respect their perspective. But I also ask people to take a look at the science behind it too. And there are a couple of studies that have shown that when people were fed MSG in a blind taste testing, many of the people on the product that did not contain MSG, but since they were told it was an MSG research, said, oh, I've got a headache. And people who ate the MSG food and were told it did not contain MSG didn't complain about any untoward effects, even though they had self-identified as being MSG sensitive. So it goes all over the spectrum from one end to the other. As dietitian, I want to respect what people say, but I also ask them do a little self-education there too.
Well, and I think you really, when we talk about food behaviors and food preferences, sometimes those are based also on preconception and what we think is going to happen. We've all eaten food somewhere along the line, and we may have had a negative reaction, and then every time that food comes back up, or we think we're going to eat it, suddenly we don't like it, and realizing that because we have a bias going into it, So I only have a couple of those, but I do. But yeah, it's the mind tells us sometimes more than what's actually there exists.
Exactly. And I can give you an example from my childhood. To this day, I don't eat lima beans because my mother burned a pot of lima beans and we ate them anyhow because we were very poor. My parents ran a Chinese hand laundry. And to this day, I look at lima beans and I know they taste like the way burned rubber smells.
Well, I didn't know we had that in common as well because we they weren't burned, but we had to. That was part of the garden grown on the farm, and I really didn't care for lima beans. And I tried to negotiate the fact that if I didn't eat them, I didn't need to shell them in the summer because beans and lima beans and peas are a real pain to shell. And so I tried, that didn't really work with my mother, but to this day, I am not a lima bean fan. So even though they were fresh out of the garden, it was not something I enjoyed. So, I think that goes back to what you're talking about, MSG and even some of the blind tests, is sometimes we have a perception that it causes a reaction or we don't like it, and it may be based on surrounding circumstances that have created that. So I think when we kind of wrap up the conversation around MSG, I think is what you for years having really looked at this and you grew up with it, and the fact is this flavor is not just isolated, is that at this point it's a safe ingredient.
It's not only a safe ingredient, but it can add to the health of a diet too. Because if you substitute MSG for a small portion of the salt in your diet, you actually have a lower sodium in diet. And we know that most people in Western cultures, at least in the United States, eat way too much salt, and that can lead to some, diseases that we want to avoid, like high blood pressure. And by using MSG as a replacement for salt, you decrease the salt amount, but you don't decrease the taste.
That's a great tip because I think anybody that hears sodium in immediate says, oh, I need to reduce my sodium intake, so therefore I won't use it or shouldn't be, but sometimes don't associate that with salt. So the good news is what you just mentioned is that replacement, one, improves and reduces the amount of sodium, but yet enhances the flavor, which is many times why we're using salt in the first place.
Correct. And let me give you an example of how I use MSG that was in my, salt shaker. We were hosting a group of Mongolian sculptors who were in Breckenridge, Colorado for the International Snow Sculpture Contest. And they came down to Denver after being in that cold and snow and ice. And they are very famous. They have won gold, silver, audience choice and artist choice in their sculptures there. But it's a cold environment. And so I made them this big pot of soup. And soup is very big part of Mongolian food culture. And I put in a lot of vegetables and a lot of meat. These are big guys. There are about, well over a half dozen of the sculptors that came. So I made this huge pot of soup. And I kept on tasting it and adding a little herb, maybe a little bit more salt. Maybe I need to put in more meat. And finally, I put in half a teaspoon of MSG. The depth of flavor was amazing. It just blossomed. And those sculptors came into my kitchen eating bowls of soup. Nobody even said anything. They ate for 15 minutes without talking. And that's what MSG can do.
It can make people quit talking. No, I think that's a perfect example, though, what a small amount of flavoring can enhance something without all the, quote, adding more salt. So I think I better reevaluate my urban spice cabinet. You mentioned the good news is you mentioned you were hosting Mongolia, and I think in previous episodes in this is I had the fabulous experience of experiencing Mongolia with Mary Lee and her husband Jim almost 3 years ago now. So being able to interact in those cultures of food have been wonderful over the years of just exploring additional different cultures. But also, I've also experienced baseball with Mary Lee, and I think it's always fun. Just we talk about food and flavor and ingredients, but everybody has other passions as well. And for one who grew up near Cincinnati, the Reds were one of my and have been my favorite, and I'm happy to say they're, at least the last time I looked, tied for first, which is amazing. But I'm giving Mary Lee a lot of credit. She is a diehard baseball fan, and it is true passion when it comes to the Rockies at this point. But you're a great fan.
It does mean that you have to have a certain amount of dedication. At least people are, uniform in their opinion about the Rockies, because every sports organization, media, magazine has ranked them last this year. You may have noticed I stopped smiling as much, but
Right.
I have some great news about baseball. The Savannah Bananas are coming to Denver, and I was able to get tickets. And so I am so looking forward to that.
Well, and I think as we wrap this up, we really need to talk about the fact of influence of baseball and culture, that you and I both got to experience a South Korean baseball game on our way back from Mongolia 3 years ago. And I would say it's everything that people have ever said. We ate the spiciest food I have ever consumed. We probably, and I've lived in humidity, very warm, but it was probably the most high-charged, constant cheering, crowd engaging game I have ever been to.
It was so much fun. And I still remember sitting in that game and having sweat just drip off my hair. And then we ate that very hot Korean chicken, and flames just coming out of our mouths.
And I've never downed a full sugar soft drink so fast in all my life, because it was like to offset, not only to offset the flames, so to speak, but also just being so thirsty. But it was, I did say one thing about a South Korean baseball game. If you are a baseball announcer, you have no career in South Korea, because the reality is everything is on electronic boards. I mean, and the crowd watches it. They know who's playing, but they're constant chanting, and there are cheerleaders in the audience, and people waving things, and I'm like, this is amazing. They do it the whole game.
I know. And I'm kind of looking forward to a similar experience with a lot of audience participation when the Savannah Bananas come to town. As a matter of fact, you had to enter a lottery, and if your name got picked, then you could buy tickets. They're so popular. And I will say, I am really pleased to hear that American baseball is coming back into being a favorite of fans these days. You know that football will always be king, but baseball is actually coming back, and that really pleases me. There's nothing like sitting in the stadium on a sunny day, drinking a cold beer, even eating a hot dog for a dietitian, and watching the game. And I will take the Rockies whether they win or lose, but I do wish they would win just a little bit more.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up, is really talking about, again, is that the connection of food, flavor, and an experience is so important. And when sometimes we want to separate an ingredient from looking at the whole cultural aspect of food, and really realize that many times it's the ingredients, and not only the ingredients in the food, but the ingredients around us, that really creates that hopefully positive. But I think as you've described the story around MSG, it also shows that how that experience created a negative situation that frankly may have never been there in the first place. So it gives us an opportunity to realize the importance of kind of realizing of enjoyment, that food is about enjoyment, and that there's a lot of ingredients and cultural cuisines for us to enjoy.
Absolutely correct. And, educate yourself and, enjoy your food. While we know it's easy to go for the quick fixes, really, there are really absolutely no bad foods and absolutely great best foods. I think we need to look at it with a little bit more of a discerning eye, and also to trust the science.
Exactly. So that's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you, Mary Lee. We have talked about giving us a great overview of MSG, and on the podcast show notes, we'll add some resources too as a reference. And once again, thank you. Great to see you, and thanks for your time.
Pleasure. I love this conversation. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks. Thank you for listening, Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition, because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.